If I can just make a start, we don't have as much time as we should have, although lunch is going to be, I believe, delayed. Thank you for being here. I'm not going to spend time introducing members of the panel. If they wish to do that, they can do that themselves, because we have 5 speakers and not a great deal of time, so we're going to get on with the speaking. And the first speaker is Koen Breedveld. Some of you have already heard him speak from the Institute. Comparative Sports Policy Research. It's actually quite a small constituency. Thank you, Koen.
Okay, thank you very much. There's only 10 minutes. I'm going to keep this very brief and don't have many slides, just one. You can put it up. My main point would be that, I guess, if I can use this, it's quite plain and simple. I mean, the main goal of sport policies would be to improve sport participation. And you can invest in a lot of stuff. You can invest in elite sports and you can invest in elite events. But if it doesn't bring something to promote sport participation, why do you do it for? I mean, if people don't participate in sports, they're never going to accrue the effects that we assign to sports. They need to participate to be able to enjoy the effects of sports. And it also goes the other way around. If people don't participate in sports, they will not appreciate elite sports and elite sport events. So in fact it goes both ways. And by promoting in fact sport participation, that would be my main message, I think you do need to invest, for instance, like in sport infrastructures, and you can invest in sport events. The problem though is that we don't have yet sports for all in Europe. We've been aiming for sport for Europe for a long time, but not every country, any people are doing sports. And within countries we can see that a lot of people are lagging behind. Low status groups, low income groups, low education groups, people from ethnic minorities lag behind when it comes to sport participation. We just don't have a sports for all yet in Europe. And the important thing is that those changes are quite resilient, those differences are quite resilient to change. We've been putting effort in trying to raise sport participation level among ethnic minorities and among lower educated people. But as Hanne showed yesterday, those differences are quite resilient to change. It needs a lot of effort to change that. Sport actually excludes as much as it includes, I would say, still at present. But then we want to change that. We want it to be a sports for all, also in Europe. The problem is that raising sport participation is actually quite hard work. The problem is that all of the partners that are involved, neither of them has the full reach or the full power to actually raise the sport participation levels. The budget are limited. The budget are usually put forward by coincidence. It's just a political argument. How much budget you have could be 33 million per year. But it's never been a calculation like, if we really want to raise the sport participation levels, we need so much million. We don't make those kind of calculations. We're not able to make the calculations because we don't actually know what are effective interventions. And if some of the scientists know what the effective interventions are, the politicians don't know it yet. So it's very hard to actually try to raise sport participation, and it does take a lot of work. I've explained yesterday a little bit why that is a lot of hard work. That is because sport participation is rooted in habits that are being formed at a very young age. That is the importance of investing in physical education, because at that age, through physical education, you can actually create a long-lasting habit, a long-lasting taste for sport participation that will take you a long road for people that are in their adult phases. Whether you sport as an adult is greatly determined at a very young age, and that's why you need to invest in physical education. And even then, I mean, there's so many things you can do, there's so many choices that you can make. We kind of seem to forget as sports people that for most people, sport is not top of mind. Sport is just something you can do that you can easily miss out on. If you get tired, and the miracles of sports, the benefits of sports, it doesn't really show you after you have been sporting. It shows you on a long-term effect. If you're like 20 or 40 years you've been sporting, then you can see that you get more healthy. But generally, sport is something that makes you tired, you can easily miss out on it, and a lot of other things you can do with your spare time. So basically, raising sport participation level isn't that easy. There are no quick wins and no easy fixes. Then who should do that? Who should form the policies? And my main message would be that neither the federations, nor the clubs, nor the municipalities are very good in reaching out to new audiences. Municipalities are mostly there for keeping control, for making sure that the facilities are there, that money is not being misspent. Clubs are mostly there for bonding their members, for bonding their own members, not for reaching out to new audiences. Federations are mostly there for organizing sport competitions, for administrating sport competitions. That is the main goal, that is the main strength. Just as a very, as a very simple example, I've organized a swimming competition in my own city, close to Utrecht, a suburb of Utrecht. And I organized a swimming competition to make sure that more people participated in swimming. Not in the cold waters like here in Denmark, but a little bit more warmer water. And I thought, if I want to promote the swimming competition, it's in open waters like here in Denmark, but in warmer. If I want to stimulate people to join the swimming competition, I should put a leaflet in the swimming pools that there is a competition that people can join. So I go to the swimming pools and ask the swimming pools, can I put a leaflet here to promote my swimming competition to stimulate swimming participation? And the answer I get from the swimming pools, not one, but three. The answer I get is, you can't put a leaflet here, sir. You can't promote other activities that do not belong to the activities in our swimming pool. We are not a commercial organization. We just run a swimming pool. And I just say to them, I want to promote swimming activities in our cities. I want to promote more people that go swimming. You can't do that, sir. This is just for the swimming pool. We do not promote other activities than the activities in the swimming pool. And I'm telling you this not to make a ridicule of the swimming pools in my city, of the municipality that I live in. But I think it's a very typical case of how people that run facilities from municipalities argue and think about the way that they do the job. The municipalities and the clubs and the federations are really poor at reaching out to new audiences. So that's my third point. So the fourth point, I think, is that if you really want to sell sports, and selling seems like an ugly word. If you want to persuade people to be active in sport participation, that is the language that we use to. If you want to persuade people to be active in sport participation, we need the power of the businesses and the marketeers. If you just simply look at the growth that we had in sport participation and where it came from, the growth came from golf. The growth came from fitness. The growth came from running. The growth came from that stupid person that invented it if you walk like this. You know that? Nordic walking? And all of a sudden, you give two people 2 sticks and they enjoy Nordic walking. So the growth comes from the inventors of people that invented Nordic walking, from the running companies and the running event companies, from the fitness companies and from the golf companies. If we hadn't had the commercial sector, we wouldn't have witnessed the growth in sport participation that we've witnessed in the last couple of decades. That's my definite point. So, just to make it sure, I am a huge fan of sports clubs. I'm 49 years old, I've been a member of sports clubs for 43 years. I'm a volunteer in 2, I do a lot for the clubs that I belong to. I really think that being able to participate in the sport club brings you something extra than to just join a fitness center. I hate fitness. Terrible, that's not even a sport. Coming to the sport clubs brings you a chance to participate in organizing the activity itself and not just buying a product. So I am a huge fan of sport clubs and federations. It just seems to me that if you want to promote sports and promote physical activity, we do need the power that the marketeers in the sport business has to offer to us. That would be my main point. Thank you.
Thank you, Koen. I'm suggesting we keep all the questions and answers to the end because we hope that the presentations will be complementary to each other and distinctive from each other. And there'll be a synthesis. I must say I'm interested in the comment about swimming pool managers because I have the same prejudice. Yeah. So,
it's not prejudice, it's fact.
And this is a researcher talking, right? Karen Petry, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Koen. I'm also a fan of sport clubs, and I hate fitness too. So I don't know. Perhaps it has also something we have to do some research on. So I'm going to present very briefly the role of governmental actors in the sport political infrastructure, which is a really broad topic, and it's, well, quite a challenge to do that in 10 minutes. which means I try to be as short as possible with a short introduction. Then I will refer to some aspects in relation to ministries, finances, policy and programs, and also to conclude in order to have perhaps also some points for the discussion. The main content I'm presenting here will be published in a book, mainly ready. This is a book which I edited together with a colleague in my university, and it's about comparative sport development, systems participation and public policy. I mentioned that, and I don't get any income from whatever who buys the book. I just wanted to mention that we did a kind of comparative work with 23 different countries, 12 from Europe and 11 from abroad. And it was the idea formally initiated at the last Play the Game conference when we had a measure group meeting, and we thought it could be nice to have more and more comparative information. It's not comparative in itself as a method, because we didn't do any evaluation stuff in the field, but we really forced our contributors and authors to follow a very strict guideline. Someone here in the room, they know what we are talking about. And for sure we also have this chapter about the role of the ministries and the governments, and my presentation here is based on what is actually written from the authors in this book. It will be published in December, I hope. Which is also a basic, I went to MIRAGE 5, which is the international conference on the sports ministers, which was held in Berlin this spring. And what was one of the results of this MIRAGE 5? That we received a high interest of the member states of the UNESCO to participate in Berlin, which means that this reflects the recognition of the potential of the power of sport to contribute to social and economic development. So this is, let's say, one of the aspects is it results itself. The other thing is, if I'm referring to the role of the government actors in the sport political infrastructure, that we can see it is a highly diverse situation, which means it is really unfold and quite sophisticated picture when we analyze it. So referring back to the book, we have 23 countries, and I can tell you each country has a ministry, the name of the ministry, the implementation of the sports policy at international, at governmental level, and there's really nothing really similar. So I cannot really give a uniform statement regarding the influence of the governmental organizations. But what I can do is that I will describe this variety, especially in relation to the government responsibility, for example, in centralist states, which means there is organization at national level, for example, in China and in France. We also have the federal state like Germany, where sport lies within the responsibility of the regional state governments, or in Belgium, sporting issues are a matter of free language communities. And what we just heard recently in the panel, the situation of Brazil. This is something which is really typical, I would say. So sport has a long history from different ministries, from different responsibilities, and some countries decide at least to have a sports minister and a sports ministry. So this is the case, for example, in India, but also in England and in France. And just some highlights, some examples. I can also put some other countries here. We have also countries where sport is integrated, for example, in Mexico, the Secretary of Public Education, or in New Zealand, the Ministry of Cultural Heritage, or here in Germany, the Ministry of the Interior. And this also shows the governmental interest, but also perhaps, let's say, the recognition and the power that sport has. So if you take a look to the ministry, the name and the environment, where is sport located, it gives you also good information about the situation of the sport within the country. For example, in Germany, we have the Ministry of the Interior, which is responsible, but we have also a couple of other ministries dealing with sport issues. For example, I think it's the main country is the Ministry for Health, or the Family Affairs, Women and Youth, the Economic Cooperation Development or the Federal Foreign Office. So lots of countries also do have sport in the Ministry of Defense or whatever, so it's part of a global other national policy and not only related to sport. When we look at the government, I think the main point is that we look at the finances, because the government distributes the finances in our system, and the policy behind that is, well, what we can say, at least the government policy. And for sure, in its sport, but also sport for all activities are in place. So the ministries and departments finance in most cases a nationwide sporting organization, that's clear. They finance the National Olympic Committees, but also the regional governments, which provide also funds for local governments. When we analyze what is written in our chapters, we see, well, both aspects are represented, the sport for all, but also the high-performance sport. And sometimes if you read then the description coming from the ministry, you can see that there is, well, sometimes a clear focus on high-performance sport, and sport for all is just, well, let's say an annex or whatever. But you can also see countries where sport for all is in the program and in the policy very well mentioned, and it is, well, more or less even written on the national plans. What that means I would like to tell you later on. We also have a lot of health enhancing strategies, for sure gender policy. If you take a look at what is really in the papers and in the plans of the governments, it's all in, and the list of the tasks are even longer. The strategic papers, for example, just a short for Finland, the Fit for Life program, or the Finnish Schools on the Move program. In Poland we have the Strategy of Sport Development until 2015. In Australia we have a National Sport and Active Recreation Policy Framework. So in relation to the government work and the homework they did, I would say it's all done. But what does it mean for the implementation? We see in relation to the impact of these programs and strategies and policies, first, a clear lack of surveys and data about the success and the failure. You really cannot find any information about programs which are unsuccessful. It's, well, not mentioned in any of these papers. The second aspect is that the findings are not always translated into what this means for them. For example, how much crime and antisocial behavior can sport interventions help to reduce? To what extent have they prevented young people from becoming not in education, not in employment, or in training? So once we have some kind of evaluation, it's just a description, but well, following sometimes with some recommendation. But what is needed are cost and benefit analysis, which means we need to know how much do we have to invest in sport for all activities, and then in order, what is the benefit for the overall society. Last point, short conclusion. The governments around the world have difficulties to implement their policies. For example, when I prepared this presentation here, I again referred to the UNESCO Charter of Physical Education and Sport from 1978, which was widely expected, more or less from all countries, but it's only rhetoric. The translation of this policy into practice is needed more than ever. And governments really should highlight also their failures and invest more in monitoring, evaluation, and cost and benefit analysis. Thank you for your attention, and hope to discuss a little bit later on.
Karen, thank you. Bang on time, terrific timekeeping. And now we have James Dorsey. You're going to sit, James?
No, we'll stand.
Okay. She's just trying.
Thank you. In contrast to what Koen and Karen have done, which is looking at sports policy as such, I want to take this beyond the realms of that And I come out of this not from a world of sports, but from a career focus and also a personal history of ethnic and religious conflict and geopolitics. We've talked a lot over the last 4 days and had valuable and incisive contributions on issues of transparency, of accountability, of the battle against corruption, and of reform. Fact of the matter is that in all of those discussions, in my mind, the elephant in the room was not put on the table. And that elephant is the inextricable relationship between politics and sports. In my mind, nowhere is that more evident than in, certainly in the Middle East and North Africa, and to a large degree, for example, in Asia. We've had some references to it in the last few days. Tolga Şenol, when he was speaking about Turkish football, spoke about the sponsorship relationships, all of which are governmental. In fact, if you were to look at the match-fixing scandal in Turkey, no match-fixing scandal, to the best of my knowledge, is more political than that one. And just look at the way the discussion on penalties for the match fixers was. The Prime Minister from his sickbed reduced through Parliament the penalties for those who were going to be sentenced at that point for match fixing. The President refused to sign the law, and so the Prime Minister went back to the Parliament and got what he wanted, and then enforced it on the Turkish Football Federation. Andreas, in his presentation on Sochi, spoke about the geopolitical impacts and risks that were involved in the Winter Olympics in Russia. If you looked at this year's election of the successor to Mohammed bin Hammam, to fulfill his term as president of the Asian Football Confederation, and Ben knows a lot about this, there was nothing illegal, there was nothing wrong with that election of Sheikh Salman Ibrahim bin Khalifa of Bahrain. There may be some questions if you looked at the way the election campaign was waged, in which the Kuwaitis single-handedly were able to strong-arm, including the Chinese, to ensure that Sheikh Salman was going to be elected. But there are moral, as far as I am concerned, issues of morality, issues of integrity, issues of public perception that have not been addressed in that election. Sheikh Salman is head of the Bahraini Football Association. He was head of that association for a very long time, and he was head of that association during the brutal squashing of a popular uprising on the island in 2011. There have been allegations that his office was actively involved in the identification of 150 sports officials and athletes who were summarily dismissed from their jobs because they allegedly had participated in those demonstrations. Those allegations have never been proven. But fact of the matter is that the Bahraini government, to its credit, did initiate an independent investigation into what had happened during those protests, and did conclude that there was police brutality, that there was torture. 3 of those people were national soccer team players. They were denounced on television as traitors of the country. They were arrested. They were tortured. In some cases, they were sentenced to prison, although those sentences were never really implemented because of pressure from FIFA. Sheikh Salman has never said a word about this, even though his own government had instigated an independent investigation. He has expressed no sympathy for them. His statement was, politics stops at the door of the Bahrain Football Association. It flies in the face of what the reality is. If you wanted to take this far broader, if you look at the boards of football associations across the Middle East and North Africa, they are all run by members of ruling families of government appointees, whether or not there was a formal election or not. Stronger, I would argue that FIFA has been a pillar of support, basically a pillar of Western policy. If Western policy throughout the last decades, and no one less than actually George W. Bush admitted this after 9/11, when he conceded that the policy of stability in the Middle East is what helped produce 9/11. FIFA has been extremely instrumental in this. If you were to look at the Egyptian Football Premier League and you were to apply the rules of FIFA, you have to have your own stadium. You have to be financially self-sufficient. More than half of the Egyptian Premier League clubs would be disqualified right now and here. There would be no discussion. That's true for many of the leagues. Iran is another example of that. In fact, if you looked at the history of a vast number of football and sports clubs in the Middle East and North Africa, perhaps even the majority, what you would see is that they were all founded with political associations. And those political associations, in many cases, may no longer be what they were at the time. Monarchies, certainly in North Africa or in Egypt, for example, no longer exist. But nonetheless, the association with politics is there. The reason in the Middle East and North Africa, at least, was that there is no controlled, there is no uncontrolled, or the aim is to have no uncontrolled public space. And therefore, stadiums and the kind of emotions that football evokes had to be controlled. It was also the sport, the most popular form of popular culture, and therefore, alongside religion, if you could associate yourself with that, then that could reflect positively on your regime. In fact, interestingly enough, the one example where lack of performance by a national team led to two important things. One was the regime wanted distance from the Football Association, even though it still wanted to control it. And in one of the least democratic countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, fans, for the first time ever, forced a member of a ruling family to resign. And not only to resign, but to institute a democratic election in a country that sees that as an infidel institution. The point I'm trying to make is that this is an inextricable relationship. There's no point, we're kidding ourselves, if we continuously argue that these things are separate. Rather than doing so, what we really should be doing is putting it on the table. It's a relationship that is joined at the hip, and we might as well look at ways in which we can develop codes of conduct, forms of some charter that governs that relationship, whatever form of oversight or regulation you want to look at. But as long as we do not do that, the talk of accountability, of transparency, and even of reform is going to be talk and have very little real impact. Thank you.
Again, to time, I'd just like to make one comment about the classic case of unintended consequence sometimes with political intervention. When FIFA sent home the Iranian women's football team because they insisted on wearing hijab, it inadvertently brought the biggest governmental support for that women's team that could possibly have happened because of the way in which Iran resented that intervention by FIFA. So it was a really quite ironic little piece of political intervention which had exactly the different consequence from what was intended by FIFA. So that's a nice example.
Well, you could add that Ahmadinejad was a fervent soccer player and fervent supporter of the game. It had two consequences. One was he micromanaged the Iranian Football Association, but he brought so much bad luck to the national team that fans were actually quite grateful if he would not appear in a match.
Thank you, James. Over to you, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret, and thanks for citing these examples. Thanks, James, for basically passing the ball over to my topic then, which is the role of the international sport governing bodies. And I'm looking at the case of the Asian Football Confederation. Therefore, I've structured the presentation as follows. I will firstly take a look at the topic and approach, then outline the findings and results of the study this presentation is based on, and then provide a brief overview of perspectives and a short outlook. Just for your information, although I'm a so-called young researcher, I've decided to go for the old school style of presenting, mainly by manuscript, so don't be irritated. Now, drawing upon the findings of my doctoral project, which was concerned with the case study of the AFC, as well as an analysis of sport political approaches and concepts in the context of research, I will argue that international sport governing bodies and federations should act as what I call skillful negotiators and responsible stakeholders in a globalized sport political infrastructure in order to help solving the pressing issues. As for the relevance of studying sports and football in Asia, as well as the role of AFC, it is notable that while the general focus on Asia has increased in the context of wider demographic, socio-economic and cultural developments, the following aspects, just to name a few, make sport in Asia particularly interesting. These are the continent's size and diversity, the different levels of development, infrastructure and participation, commercialization and professionalization, the political interests of federations and their individual representatives, as James pointed out, the status of women in sports, the issue of sport and religion, as well as the pervasive dangers stemming from corruption and match fixing. So how does AFC face these challenges, and which role does it play in this context? In order to answer these questions, the study concentrated on AFC's relations with other actors, its organizational structure and decision-making processes, as well as policies and strategies. Drawing upon a comprehensive collection of data, including interview and archive material, as well as 3 theoretical perspectives: globalization, neo-institutionalism and governance, a qualitative analysis of AFC was provided. So turning to findings and results, I will firstly begin with the relations AFC has with other actors. AFC is in principle part of a self-regulated governing system of one specific sport, namely football, in which it mainly interacts with football governing bodies in relation to competitions, development and regulation. However, globalization and commercialization processes have affected the sports sector and created new challenges and an increase of cross-sectional constellations, collaborations and conflicts, in the course of which different institutional control systems and modes of interaction have become relevant. Probably the best example is the Bosman case. AFC engages, for instance, increasingly with governmental actors, not only in cases of interference in the so-called autonomous sports sector, but also with regard to hosting tournaments, tackling match fixing and corruption, doping abuse, changing legislation for professionalization measures, or installing infrastructure. Meanwhile, the development of the game and the optimization of grassroots and youth football structures have led AFC to interact with a variety of actors, including governments, other confederations, FIFA, member associations, civil society organizations, and commercial enterprises. The area therefore constitutes a good example for how important it is for AFC to act as a skillful negotiator in order to ensure successful outcomes through employing hybrid models along the lines of private-public partnerships. Most notably is obviously the significance the market sector and therefore economic and commercial actors have, as Koen pointed out. The fact that the Confederation, AFC, has entered deals with the so-called World Sport Group and other commercial actors generating huge amounts of income indicates this development. Turning to organization and decision-making, it it is notable that AFC is part of an institutional framework which is primarily defined by FIFA. Its structures and statutes are basically aligned and therefore in principle, such as in most sport federations, reflect a system of deliberation and decision-making that has been established more or less a century ago, in a time when the sports sector was nowhere near to what it is today in economic terms. While commercialization and professionalization are considered important aspects in order to develop the sport, the federations, however, maintain their status as non-profit organizations. This ambivalence is stressed by the fact that, for instance, AFC generates considerable amounts of income. Bearing this in mind, political processes within the governing bodies often lack transparency and accountability. Although the formal structures foresee a basic separation of power, cases of corruption, mismanagement and discrimination have tarnished the reputation of sport governing bodies. This is closely related to the fact that until now hardly any proper check and balance systems nor any sanction mechanisms have been in place. As a matter of fact, Asian football and AFC have frequently been in the spotlight of the discussion, in particular in 2011, when then AFC President bin Hammam was accused of bribery and corruption. In addition, debates emerged on the democratic credibility of AFC's organs, such as the Congress or the Executive Committee, which have often been sites for political power games and individual interests, with the conflicts mostly taking place behind the scenes. In fact, it is questionable whether the one-member, one-vote principle is feasible under consideration of the dramatic discrepancies and different interests between the countries. Also, the election procedures, tenures, and appointment of posts have been at the center of discussion. The fact, though, that ethical aspects of sport governance have found their way into the public discourse has indeed led AFC to at least initiate reforms, albeit the outcomes remain to be evaluated. Policies and strategies. The historical raison d'etre of AFC is its task to run the game and ensure its jurisdiction and regulation. This includes primarily the organization of competitions, as well as the selection of host countries. It also encompasses dealing with anti-doping matters and other violations, which are in principle to be sanctioned through the judicial mechanisms within the sports sector. This means that on the expenditure side, as we see up there, this is a graph from 2009 I have to mention, make up 70%, competitions make up 70%, while only 10% are invested in development and education. And ironically, the overall objective of AFC's marketing rhetoric is to make Asia the most lucrative football market in the globe in order to reinvest in grassroots structures and create local football identities. However, it is to say that the objective is actually underlined by the fact that AFC does send out special mission teams to improve and establish football structures. The so-called Professional Football Development Project, which includes working together not only with member associations and governmental actors, but also with other confederations such as UEFA in order to secure sustainable frameworks, adds to this policy. In the area of technical and educational matters, AFC puts a strong focus on developing the game at all levels through qualification schemes and assisting through direct implementation. The diversity and discrepancy between the member associations, though, pose a major challenge in this context. Thus, AFC depends strongly on the commitment and flexibility of the associations, governmental actors and civil society, as well as FIFA. With regard to its CSR activities, meanwhile, AFC partners with local actors and NGOs, such as the Asian Football Development Project under the aegis of Prince Ali and the FAO. In perspectives, themes such as inclusion and gender empowerment shall be put more on the agenda in order to raise awareness. Finally, perspectives and outlook. A recent Play the Game press release entitled "The Silent Scandal of the Sports World" referred to declining figures in sports participation and lacks of access to adequate infrastructure, and how these are actually related to bad governance and the fact that sport governing bodies often maintain poor links with core stakeholders and don't deliver attractive programs. Now, given the interrelatedness of all these issues, a real comprehensive sport political approach and a balanced sport governance system are needed. A level playing field with a reasonable degree of responsibility, regulation, negotiation, and division of competence amongst the key players, including the sport governing bodies. From an academic and therefore from an ICSSPE perspective, this means conducting more sport political research with a focus on actors and structures, identifying intersections and potentials for collaboration, as well as providing policy advice and support. From a political perspective, meanwhile, dichotomies between collaboration and competition autonomy and independence, regulation and self-regulation require a reconsideration in order to enhance cross-sectoral and comprehensive sport political approaches. In fact, all actors have to recognize the importance of creating synergies in an institutionalized framework with dedicated leaders, recognizing own strengths and weaknesses and sharing competencies for the sake of a coherent strategy. Recent positive examples include the declaration of Berlin from this year's World Conference of Sport Ministers, which Koen has cited, the enlarged partial agreement on sport initiated by the Council of Europe, or, as mentioned previously, AFC's multilateral approach in the context of football development, or when working together with FIFA and Interpol with regard to tackling match fixing. While a lot of work remains to be done, institutionalized and monitored, these initiatives do provide potential for finding a consensus between profit, participation and performance. Thank you very much, and sorry for being a bit long there.
Thank you, Ben. I'm going to try to talk about the whole issue of holistic sport policies, but also to try and wrap in some of the things that I thought other people were going to say, and try and a little bit of synthesis as well. So, myths. These are in the title, Myth, Mirage or Must. Myths persist despite the facts. They're very, very strong. They're as comforting as fairy tales. And ministers like comfort. They do not like going outside their comfort zone. They're very uncomfortable if they're outside their comfort zones. And if we're scientists, I always use this quote from Karl Popper because it seems to me to be so important for us. Whenever a theory appears to you as the only possible one, it's a sign that you've neither understood the theory nor the problem it was intended to solve. And the problem is we have usually ministers, quite often civil servants, who only want one problem-solving solution. They don't want to look at alternatives. That's the political process. And one of our problems in this whole area is that we have so little data about the political process because it's under the radar. And people don't even record the process or the dynamics retrospectively when they're able to do so, when their confidentiality is at an end. This is one of our challenges. So political analysis, quite often, policy analysis, quite often, depends far too much on the published document, which gives you no notion of the struggles, the power struggles, the horse trading that has gone on to allow that document to be published. So all of us looking at policy analysis need to know how limited it is. But going back to myth, Popper also said science must begin with myths and with the criticism of myths. That's how, particularly in the social sciences, breakthroughs have happened. It's no accident that sociology has as a technical term, crap detection. Okay, mirage. Mirage. What's illusory? What's misleading? What's ephemeral? It disappears as you approach it. It can be very dangerous. It threatens reality. And yet, maybe mirages are also about desirable ends. It's what we want to see. So maybe they're not wholly to be disregarded, but they can be dangerous. And I'll refer to MINEPS 5 as well, the Conference of Ministers, which happened in May this year. Because one of the most remarkable sessions was the ministerial session itself, when you had so many recurrent requests for help from ministers and senior officials. Help with infrastructure, especially governance, which they saw as a shield against corruption. For advocacy and positioning, and a case for investment, and they recognising that sport is in a marginal position with most national budgets, and the outcome frequently relating to claims for health and social development. I'll come back to that. And there's this common acceptance throughout the whole conference and in ministerial utterances anyway, is that they have to make these tough choices, investment either in medals or participation. Here's another myth. So we've got some challenges. Karen said earlier that she thought the governments had done the work, but they hadn't done the implementation. I'm not sure that they've always done the work, because I don't think they've got the concepts clear. There's tremendous blurring and confusion and lack of understanding of the blurring and confusion in policy terms. Another challenge is where to start in countries which totally lack infrastructure. That's a really tough question. Methodological challenges, lack of baseline data and information. You know, I was working in Tanzania a couple of years ago. The federations don't even know the number of clubs they have, and the clubs don't know how many members they've got. There are no records. And I'm sure Ben will tell you about some of the records in terms of the Asian Football Association, or not. And so all of these are really important challenges. The structural inequalities, which can be reflected in sports structures and cultures, particularly in terms of gender and culture and income group, ethnicity. All of this, not just in developing countries or countries reconstructing after conflict, but all countries, all of this exacerbated by the revolving door of ministerial appointments, particularly in sport in some countries. They go in and out every other month. They're never there long enough to make a difference. The career paths of civil servants. It's not in their interests to see the bigger picture. They've got their narrow milestones to meet for promotion and progression. Party political switches we've heard about already, and the marginal position of sport ministries within government. Even when they're in powerful ministries like education, within that they occupy a marginal position. And then these conflicting claims and expectations for sport, national pride, health, youth social development, anti-crime, Karen mentioned these, and sports dependence on others' agendas. And we allow that to continue. And you've got this persistent return to these difficult choices. This is what politicians often say when they've made unpopular decisions. So we have challenges for sport policymakers. They often talk about the big three, education, health and sport. But actually, if you look at the diagram and you think about it, it isn't the big three. It's the big two with sport in a subservient position. It's a supplicant for educational budget or health budget. And it actually isn't very good at securing either. And sport budgets are a fraction of those budgets, or indeed any other aspect of governmental investment. Where is sport for sport's sake in the policy landscape? And I would suggest it's actually quite weak. One of the problems is definitions. Physical activity, physical education, sport. They're used interchangeably, especially by ministers, bless them. Most of them talk about sport. But they are different, and there are policy implications about those differences, and we need to understand those. So I'll whip through these because I'm an academic and I'm into definitions, but you might not be. Physical activity, a really broad term, but look at what it embraces. Active play and routine habitual activities such as walking and cycling, active play. Which sport policies actually include those? Physical education, we've got an ICSSPE international position statement which is endorsed by UNESCO, and UNESCO has published a very, very welcome, strong statement about that. Physical competence so that all children can move efficiently, effectively and safely and understand of what they are doing. It isn't boot camps, it's more than that. Sport, and I always go back to this definition because it's such an easy one, the institutionalised game, characterised by bureaucracy, a symbolic system, technologies specific to the sport, and a systematic induction to education systems. this is what sport is. It's very different. But it is a problematic construct, as Koen outlined in his presentation. It's elitist and exclusive, or often seen as so, only for the best, highly institutionalised, global, yet ideas and procedures are led by Western, white, male cultures. And that sport policies, therefore, can be dangerously unbalanced, really dangerously. Here's one example, and I know there was a huge effect of Australia hosting the Olympic and Paralympic Games in 2000, but is it an accident that their slippage in performance is 12 years after they virtually removed almost everything they'd achieved in community sport development policy, when they were working successfully with health and the Aboriginal populations in the end of the 90s into the 2000s, and then all that swept away to focus on elite sport. And just look at the slippage in both Olympic and Paralympic standings. Massive, massive difference. When you look at what they achieved in 2000 for a country with 20-odd million people, what a remarkable achievement. And they did that with a good community sport policy. And look where they are now, still pretty good for a country of 20 plus million, but without a community sport policy, and by the way, losing most of their physical education. So we've got these myths, and yet we've got a virtuous circle of bridges between fields of evidence around the relationships between elite sport success and participation. I won't go into these. There's a massive amount of data which almost triangulates to show that that relationship is there now. I think we need to change the pyramid myth into a house of sport. It's not about a pyramid anymore. The successful countries have houses, not pyramids. Where's physical cultures in the whole policy landscape, especially in countries which have populations which depend on physical cultures for their cultural identity? Where is this in the participation policy? And I would say almost nowhere. We know that children are active, naturally active. They will be active. This is in Indonesia during a flood time, filthy water, but the kids are all swimming. They will be active. They'll be active even if they hurt themselves. This little fella has been active and he's paid the price with his leg in a cast. But actually they need to manage risks. So they ought to be doing this. And yet society, particularly urban society, bans the activity out of them. Despite the fact that they love physical activity and learning, what do we do to them? Of course, we've got occasions like this where we're all sitting and listening and we're not active at all. The problem is that physical activity strategies are often devolved to sport. They may be competed against by sport. They may exclude early years, older people, groups which are hard to reach. And they may be denied by sport because they're jealous of what they are. It's all about leadership. And I just refer you to a movement, and again this is led by commercial sector, this is led by Nike, Designed to Move, in partnership with ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine, and ICSSPE, which has sponsored this partner session. And this is a good example of harnessing good scientific evidence. Physical activity levels going down, a global trend. You can see the arrows, you can't see the detail. They've modelled it economically. Very useful data. One of my physical activity promotion people, friends in the UK, says this is the best advocacy tool he's ever had because it really does focus the attention. Economic costs, massive. So Designed to Move, this campaign, is another good example of something that other people have referred to in terms of the commercial sector's involvement. very much a long game here. This isn't a marketing tool for Nike. It's actually something which is trying to change the culture of societies towards more young children, in particular, being physically active, and society's infrastructure allowing that physical activity and supporting that physical activity to happen. So, summary. Physical activity, the most accessible, the art of the possible. And we've talked about that, the running, the fitness, etc. The evidence base for health is strong and consistent, very strong and consistent. But health policies focus on sickness and treatment, not on prevention, including physical activity. The World Health Organization budget is only 4% devoted to non-communicable diseases. Its latest draft action plan for disabled people omits any mention of physical activity. Unbelievable. And physical activity lacks a global and national policy community. It falls between the cracks. It's an issue. Physical education, comprehensive system, not in every country, but it's the best we've got, an infrastructure available for induction into physical activity and sport. It's got a well-qualified workforce on the whole, but a weak policy community. The evidence base for benefits to education, sport and health are all weak. Not because those relationships aren't there, but because there hasn't been any research to speak of. No evidence, no research, no evidence. Sport, problematic for access, exclusive. Policy community potentially strong but very fragmented and divided on rationale because of these conceptual confusions. The evidence base for social health educational benefits is weak and inconsistent, and its own case is poor. So in terms of must, I think we need sport policies which embrace the playground to the podium and all that bit of rhetoric, but include the dynamics of participation and performance. Understand why people drop in and drop out. Understand why people switch activities. And including the right to remain mediocre. The pathway doesn't take everybody to the top, but we need to keep people in the house of sport and exploit all sectors' contributions. And then sport and physical activity policies with a lifelong approach, which accommodate shifting motivations, pressures, priorities related to life cycle, health promotion, and changing social conditions. So that's the summary, and I hope that I've tried to wrap in what everyone else has said. And now I hope we have 10 minutes for questions. Thank you. Okay, any questions? John, thank you. Can you tell who you are and... Yeah.
John Norright from University of Brighton in the UK. I enjoyed all the presentations, and I'm talking in the next session, so I won't talk too long, but I'm actually critiquing and criticizing our rush to global capitalism, and a couple of the presenters talked about the role of companies in the presentations. But what interests me is I've been teaching sport policy for the last decade or so, and I teach comparative sport policy as part of the curriculum. And two of the case studies are Norway and Australia, along with England, Canada, Germany, and the USA. So we compare all of those. Sorry, Denmark's not in the comparison, but I think the policy has been for a long time fairly close to Norway. At the end of that analysis, I asked the students, what do they think is the best sports system, or best system for physical activity, health, etc., elite sport, almost to a person. These are American students I've been teaching this course to, say Norway. Yet when I hear people talk about success in sport, especially since the 1990s, they talk about Australia. And if you look at many of the systems that have been set up in developed countries since the establishment of the Australian Institute of Sport, they're very close in similarity to that. And I noticed in one of the presentations there was a discussion, I think maybe Karen's, about the different, yeah, Finland has the Fit for Life program. England is playing to win. So I wondered if you might have maybe further comment on why we don't look at societies like Norway and Denmark, who have very high participation rates, yet do support elite athletes do well, but we talk about Australia or, say, England, British success in 2012.
Well, I asked Karen particularly to come in a moment, but just to say one thing. When I asked the Finnish Society for Research why they thought the participation rates of women were higher than those of men, which is very unusual, and it's the case in some of the Nordic countries, I was told, well, we talk about physical activity, we don't talk about sport. It's the art of the possible. And I think that tells us a great deal. It's also about the social fabric of Finland, where 30% of the female population are members of the Finnish Gymnastics Association, which is a very, very broad definition of gymnastics. So, I think it's about culture and about concept, and that's really tough to explain to ministers. They don't like those concepts at all. If you talk about culture in the UK, eyes glaze. Karen, do you want to come in?
Thank you for your comment, and well, I also like to do this comparative work, but I'm always not convinced that we can really say which is the best system existing. So it depends really on the principle, it depends on what you want to know and so on. So these example I was bringing in was just, let's say, to give an overview of what's happening and what different areas national programs are running. In relation to Norway, well, I'm not really a specialist in that, but what I know about the system in Norway is also that they have this huge informal activity level, which means outdoor activities, which means just staying abroad. I know that it's called Friluftsliv, so we are doing lots of things in relation to Germany that we're trying to copy and so on, but it's impossible really to transfer a system and, well, let's say, implemented activities to other countries. That is my consequence of all this comparative work. And I know that some countries are looking for the best existing module in relation to sport participation, but I know that they also failed in trying to implement it because the culture, as Margaret said, but also the political background is a total other topic there.
Thank you. Koen, did you want to come in? No? Okay. We have another question.
Yes, Henrik Brandt from the Play the Game in the Danish Institute for Sports Studies. Thank you for some very good presentations. And let me warn you, don't look at Norway. And this is not internal rivalry. They actually don't do very well in the sports system they have. It's a monopolized and very sleepy system that is living from a huge increase in the national GDP in Norway. So what's growing in Norway is a commercial fitness sector. It's growing, it's exploding, and then they go in the mountains, and that doesn't cost anything. But that is actually socially unequal. It's actually the rich people who do that. So and sports clubs they blow it all. They don't grow, but they just get more and more funding. And that was actually my first question, probably for you. Do you know anything in your study about the allocation of resources between Sport for All and elite sport? Can you say something about that? That was the first question. And the second question is maybe for ICSSPE and the whole Design to Move campaign, that everybody says this is a very good campaign. It says what is necessary. But Nike wouldn't really say it. They wouldn't go and say, we need to challenge these governing bodies, because they are not doing very well. They're actually doing, like we just heard from Andrew, very bad in many cases. So they wouldn't go that way. So when would they start to do that? Thank you.
Yes and no, which means in our book each country has a chapter about the finances, and we really looked for figures, for latest figures and so on. But we did not really make this comparison in relation to, well, the countries, in which area they pay more, because we thought that this is a, well, from a scientific point, not a methodological issue about that. So because we didn't really gather the data. But it could be, and we are looking to continue the work, and we will use what we have now, and perhaps we do some other secondary surveys in relation to the information, and for sure we can also give a picture later on then. My impression is, when I go through the countries, because we have European countries, but also from all other continents in the world, my expression is that especially in the so-called development world or developed countries, we really see that there is a high amount of money which is going into the high performance area. And sport participation is really, well, just quite low. We also see that there's a shift between North and Western countries, West and Eastern countries. So we also see that in the Eastern European world, there's also a high percentage of money invested into the high performance level. So it's more the tendency which you can refer to, but we don't have hard figures which prove that.
Okay, thank you, Koen.
If I may add to that, I don't have the figures for the other countries, would love to have them. But I know in the Netherlands there's been a lot of debates on elite sports for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. We want to organize the Olympics in 2028, at least we wanted it to be, we skipped the program. But there was so much interest in elite sports in the Netherlands that people said it must be that all of the money is going into elite sports in the Netherlands. And it just isn't the case. From the central government, 2/3 go to grassroots sports, and about a quarter goes to elite sports, and that hasn't changed since we adopted elite sports as a primary goal, as one of the goals for central government. So having it as a goal doesn't mean that all the budgets go to elite sports. And I'm just talking to the central government, which spends about 150 million. The local municipalities spend 1.5 billion, and all of that money is going into grassroots sports. So I'm not that pessimistic. On Nike, I really think that we should have debates like we just had on FIFA, on Nike and the label conditions that they employ to be able to manufacture cheap shoes. That is a big point. Another big point is the thing that we should learn kids that they don't always need to have Nike shoes to be physically active. You don't need the commercial products to be physically active. You just need water or sand and you can be physically active. You don't need the commercial products. And at the same time, it is in the interest of companies like Nike for people to be physically active in order for them to be able to sell shoes. So if they're interested in making people more physically active, so are we as policymakers. So are you as policymakers. I'm a researcher. So there is a common interest. There are different responsibilities, but there is a common interest. I think we can use that.
Thank you. Just two little pieces of information for you to consider in England. There's a recurrent national survey about participation, which is very useful, but it's localised, so you can actually drill down to your locality, your borough. And the London Borough of of Kensington, is one of the richest boroughs in the whole of the UK, and the property prices are the highest. It's not surprising that participation in physical activity is at its highest of all the boroughs in the whole of the UK. The incidence of volunteering in the London Borough of Kensington is the very, very lowest. Now that, I think, bears up what Koen has been saying about people with money, but it also bears up what you might say about community engagement and the questions you might ask about that. Similarly, in the old Labour government, free swimming was implemented. Who got the benefit? Higher socioeconomic groups. Massively. Didn't stop them all objecting when that funding was cut. And it hasn't actually changed the incidence of swimming very much. So these incidences are things which need to be fed into the mix. Are there any other questions, please? Jens?
Yes, I would like also to thank you very much for a very, very well organized session, very relevant contributions. I liked so much, Margaret, that you took in the definition of sport and this is just a comment, because it is such a barrier in the English language, and we always having this discussion in English. We should, I would suggest that we take the next international discussion in Swedish or in Norwegian. It takes some time to learn, but it's possible. Because in the Nordic countries, we have a tradition, a very strong tradition of using the word idrott, idrett, and that's combining sport and physical activity. Even the hardcore sports organizations use the word idrett because it gives them a little more cultural legitimacy. So, for those of you who are native English speakers, please work a little on that. And that would be great, because also physical activity and physical education, it becomes a little bit tech management-like or technical. That was one comment. The other with regard to Nike. I think it is perfectly possible when you have the world's biggest global commercial sports brand, that you can both discuss labor conditions and discuss what is in many ways a non-branded campaign. Many people recognize the communication quality and the professional quality of this campaign, and therefore it's also actually a pity that you might be right that the main commercial goals is sort of blocking Nike from participating, for instance, in Play the Game. ICSSPE has tried to get Nike here. I have tried very hard and had very many long conversations, and even though I've actually had a role to play in Nike's meeting in Portland, one important stakeholder meeting, they sort of shy away from what is getting politicized. Not only have they rejected Play the Game participation or declined, or what you would say, they were also not at the minutes, which is every 7 years you have all the sports ministries, you have really policy makers there.
Were they invited, Jens?
They were invited. ICSSPE is a key stakeholder in this campaign. There was really incentives for them to participate, but it's like they don't see the world in the same optics, and that's a pity for their campaign. And then, of course, after some years or months, we just have to move on and find. But it's a pity because professionally and from a content point of view and communication point of view, it's excellent stuff.
Thank you, Jens. One thing I would say about learning to work with other sectors is really challenging. And this has been an interesting one for ICSSPE because we co-authored this report. And my role in this was to pull back the marketing people from their excitement with metaphors, because they got absolutely, sort of carried away. So I would allow them to talk about an epidemic of inactivity, but when they started talking about infection of a non-communicable disease, I thought this was probably not a good idea. So we're back to definitions. I totally understand what you say about English language and sport, physical education, physical activity. And of course the Council of Europe definition of sport is les sports, it's the French definition, and I understand that. I still think we need to distinguish between objectives in those areas, because ministers do not. And just going back to the cultures, I think that Ben and James have very ably illustrated the way in which you might talk about a global system, but you're talking about colliding worlds of culture. And I just wondered whether you wanted to comment on that, James, Ben?
There obviously are differences in culture. I'm not sure, at least as far as I'm concerned, the inextricability of sports and politics is limited to certain cultures. I mean, granted, I think that democracies have greater checks and balances. There may be greater degrees of autonomy, but nevertheless, that does not mean that sports and politics are not still joined at the hip. So, yes, there are cultural differences. You know, there are things that happen within the AFC. Ben touched on them very briefly. You have a internal audit report that is undeniable in part of it in terms of abuse of the financial system, that raises serious questions about possible money laundering, possible bribery, possible sanction evasion. I'm fighting a libel case for the last year over that. And yet, there are a fair number of democracies in the AFC, and they have let this this report be put in a drawer and not to be pulled out again.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is very important to bear in mind that when speaking about developing holistic or comprehensive sport policies and talking about a so-called globalized sport political infrastructure, that there is actually conflict between local and global driving forces, and that is also very important. That's why my study was also based on globalization studies with regards to research and developing policies. In fact, there are a lot of discrepancies. It's very ambivalent at the same time, especially with regards to the established big sports. They are Western products, and there are certainly so-called Westernization processes going on. At the same time, just to exemplify the tension between global and local driving forces with regards to AFC, while FIFA tries, for instance, to harmonize the institutional framework, statutes, etc., AFC was actually, and despite the fact that it had been accused of corruption, bribery, and that discourse had been going on, and that there's a huge problem in Asia, AFC has been more progressive than FIFA with regard, for instance, to limiting tenures and putting females onto the executive board. So that is a response to a global driving force, and in my opinion, a good example for how complex it is and how these global and local driving forces interact with each other.
Thank you. Any one burning question? No? One thing that I would add to what I said earlier about you don't see the dynamics of the policy process. Actually, the influence of leadership is also very important, and there's been very little analysis of that, partly because so much of leadership is under the radar. So it would be really interesting to see the dynamics of the IOC representations to the countries which did send a woman for the first time to the Olympics in London last year, and whether there is any follow-up. Those sorts of dynamics are under the radar, and we really need to try and extricate them, but especially the dynamics of the big budget allocations and the way in which they shift. Ministerial whim is still very, very powerful. Well, thank you, Koen, Karen, James, Ben. Good session. Thank you. We have some information about it if anybody would like it, and one copy of Design to Move if anyone wants one.